This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
This is True Crime XS Christmas.
What were you looking at?
I was looking at the statistics on prison escapes, which is funny because as concrete of a subject as that is, the data is very scarce.
Well, I just started with that list so that you could see what the famous ones were. And
Yeah,
there's
no,
only one famous one I wanted to cover, but the rest of them are bonkers.
Well, and so I went through and I was trying to look, right? And so I started looking at the statistics and yeah, there's a lot of people that escape. Most of the time, though,
Deliberately hidden. That's the reason I'm covering it. They're
Well-
actually deliberately not released by the Department of Justice.
the numbers, you mean?
Right.
Well, yeah, because it makes them look bad.
No, it's not even that. It's actually because yes, it makes them look bad, but that's not how they get away with not releasing them. The way that they get away with not releasing them is so that they don't have to reveal certain work practices that they consider to be confidential. So,
But it's the government.
okay, federal courts don't have cameras in them.
I'm not making the connection between not having to release the data and to maintain confidentiality.
Well, it's not to maintain confidentiality. It's like this. We have an open investigation. We can't give you that information at this time.
Right.
So, but they have gone as far as to say they actually used national security in one of the instances in one of the cases that we're going to get to about this, because now I've hit record. So, I guess we're doing prisoners first. Okay, what started this off for me was back when you and we weren't doing Israel Keys. We hadn't thought of anything. We used to go through the old versions of NamUs. Do you remember when it was Find the Missing and stuff like that? Yeah. And at some point we both first realized that we looked at the website. And I don't remember when that was, but there was this one case you and I were talking about. This is so many years ago when I say this. You were looking at a girl in West Virginia that had been found by mushroom hunters. Do you remember this case that you
Yeah.
Do you remember this time when you were looking at that?
Yeah, it would have been right when NamUs became a thing.
Yeah. So when you were doing that, I realized I wasn't the only one. And at some point in the future, I was scrolling through, I don't know what, NBC, ABC, and they had this Christmas special that wasn't really a Christmas special, but it was inmates who had escaped, who had never been found again. And, when I saw it, it was it sort of indicated that there were only 7 inmates that had never been found. A couple of things happened for me there. First of all, I didn't believe that number. And it turns out that the person just had a slip of the tongue and they corrected it later in the broadcast. but they were talking about 7 inmates who had never been found. But it wasn't that like only 7 inmates had never been found. So I started going like back in time to find like the furthest ones back that I could. But here's the other thing that happened. I started wondering about, we go down this path of like the unreported missing. In my head, like a prisoner should be the opposite of that. Like if a prisoner goes missing, at least today, they should like their statistics should be an NCIC as both an escapee and a fugitive from justice, but also as a missing person. Because I cannot think of a more likely person to match to an unidentified body in a weird situation than a prisoner escapee. Because they're like by design on the run and not probably like they're already in a dangerous situation, particularly when it's like a group of escapees.
Well, the majority of the information I was looking at, it wasn't hitting that last requirement where they hadn't been recovered or found or recaptured or however you want to say it.
Uh-huh.
And so that's where I was running into problems. And then when I was looking at the tiny little bit of statistical data I could find, there was a report done in 2005, but it used data from like 1998, 1999, so it still isn't current, right?
Right.
But what I found was a larger number you would find that indicates like how many prison escapees there are. They include everything, like even people who were like on work detail and like didn't come back or whatever.
Yeah, they just kind of wander off.
So it's not like this big dramatic escape, right?
Yeah.
And so that got confusing too, because those are less interesting to me. Plus, like, people should be paying more attention than that, don't you think? Than just to
I mean,
let
generally
somebody
speaking, yes.
walk away. But overall, like, a lot of the people that escape, they're not like super violent criminals, right?
Yeah.
Some of them are, but then for the most part, the confusion in my research came from like not being able to find that many that hadn't been caught.
And see, okay, there's a difference between hadn't been caught and like it's reported that they're not caught yet. And there's what I found was there were a lot of people that are not in that famous like and I'm just going to call it the top 20. And that includes like what you were saying, like Alcatraz in the 1960s. There's this one guy in New York that's talked about a lot who escaped during the 90s. There was a death penalty guy that got out in 1990. We're going to talk about. Like, I'm going to talk about some of those cases, but those aren't the super interesting ones, just personally to me. Like, okay, here's a case of a guy that like probably is like the worst of the worst. Because Ted Bundy was also a prison escapee, but clearly he did not get away with it.
He escaped twice.
Yeah, he escaped twice, and very interesting escapes both times. Although one is a prison escape or jail escape, in my opinion, and the other one is more of a courthouse escape.
He was in custody, and then he was not in custody. So
yeah,
still
you're right. You're right. It's an escape. There was this guy named Curtis Ray Watson, and he was an inmate at the West Tennessee State Penitentiary. And on the morning of August 7th, 2019, he was on a work detail outside the residence of a prison official there named Deborah Johnson. In the afternoon of August 7th, 2019, Deborah Johnson was found strangled, and Watson had disappeared. Watson had been serving a 15-year sentence for aggravated kidnapping when he did this. So he escaped the prison grounds in Henning, Tennessee. And how do you think he did that, if you were to take a wild guess?
I assume whoever that was found strangled helped him.
No, she didn't have anything to do with it. He was just working there. The story gets bad. The funny part of the story is that he escaped her residence on a tractor. like he rode away on a tractor.
So he killed her and left.
Yeah. So law enforcement released images of his tattoos, specifically because they were thinking he would probably change his appearance pretty quickly. And a local there spotted the escaped inmate going through his yard on a home surveillance camera. And so there was a 4-day manhunt, but within hours of him being spotted on the home surveillance camera, Watson was arrested. Curtis Ray Watson was arrested. Now his story gets like terrible because so that all happens in August of 2019. Like he escapes and then he's caught. Well, in June of 2021, he ended up waiving his right to a jury trial. Curtis Watson did in relation to the escape and also to the murder of the prison administrator. So he ends up indicted on 15 criminal counts in both the prison escape and the rape and murder of Deborah Johnson, who was a Tennessee Department of Corrections administrator. He pleads guilty to 9 counts, including felony murder and perpetration of rape for strangling her while he was raping her. He ends up sentenced to life in prison without parole, whereas before he had been serving a 15-year sentence. And the judge even let him talk at his hearing. According to Action News 5, some of his statement was that he just wanted to apologize to everybody, to the Johnson family and to the state of Tennessee and all the officers at the penitentiary. He said, please forgive me for everything I've done. Now, Deborah Johnson's daughter, who's Dr. Shanae Johnson, she spoke about Watson's apology after the hearing, and she said, I can't say I necessarily accept his apology. That's something that's going to take some time. I hope and pray that in the future I can definitely accept it wholeheartedly. But just right now, can I say that I accept it? I just can't say that I can. So this is like the daughter talking after the hearing. He also pled guilty to especially aggravated burglary, aggravated rape, felony escape, theft over $10,000, burglary, theft under $1,000, and aggravated criminal trespassing. Prosecutors say that Watson escaped from the prison before raping and murdering Johnson in her home on the prison grounds. He was on the run for it's about 5 days total before he was eventually captured. In February 2020, the prosecutors had originally announced they were going to seek the death penalty against Watson. But
That's why he pled to all that.
He did, yeah. So at the time of his escape, he had been serving a 15-year sentence for especially aggravated kidnapping because he had confined his wife and he had hit her with an aluminum baseball bat back in July of 2012. He was due to get out like the way it works over there time-wise, he would have gotten out in 2022, even though that's not the full sentence. He would have gotten out right at 10 years. But instead, in 2019, he escaped and he made sure that he would never get out. The Tennessee Department of Corrections released a statement after the guilty plea, and they recounted the impact of Johnson's 38-year career with them and the countless lives she had impacted through leadership. Deborah loved being a part of the Tennessee Department of Correction, but more importantly, she loved the staff. She cared deeply about improving the lives of incarcerated people. She held the admiration and respect of her colleagues and was regarded as a knowledgeable professional who worked tirelessly to support and coach offenders in their rehabilitation. She was a devoted daughter, sister, mother, grandmother, and friend. Her absence is felt each day with our agency. That's words from Commissioner Tony Parker over there. And the Tennessee Department of Corrections said it will ensure that the court's orders were carried out and that Watson is housed according to policy and supervised appropriately, because the court felt like some of what happened there fell on lapses within the DOC. I thought that was a sad case overall.
Well, it is. And so Tennessee is a state that has something called a blue alert. And when this particular inmate got out, this is in 2019. It was the third time that a blue alert had been issued since they started using the system in 2011. So in 8 years, this was only the third time it was used. Now it's structured similarly to like, Amber Alerts, where there's criteria that has to be met.
Okay.
And but just sort of going along with what I was getting at, like this was only the third time the state of Tennessee had to do that. in 8 years.
Well, that's interesting that they have that now.
Yeah, they do. According to the TBI, the following must be met to activate a blue alert. 1, a sworn law enforcement officer is killed, sustains life-threatening injuries, or the officer is missing in the line of duty under circumstances warranting concern for the law enforcement officer's safety. And 2, the suspect poses an imminent threat to public safety and law enforcement personnel. 3, a description of the offender or vehicle is available for statewide broadcast to the public and law enforcement 911 centers. 4, prior to activation, if the suspect is or suspects are identified, the requesting agency will immediately place the suspect in the temporary felon file in the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, obtain felony warrants as soon as possible or within 24 hours, and enter the offender into NCIC. The head of any Tennessee law enforcement agency, colonel of the highway patrol, chief, sheriff, or their designee of the investigating law enforcement agency of jurisdiction requests the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to activate the blue alert system.
Huh. It's interesting that they do that.
It is interesting. I don't know what the impact is, right? Like, it doesn't seem like this guy got very far. And somebody found him on their camera, right?
Yeah.
Their home camera.
Yeah, somebody found him on the home camera. I've heard of blue alerts before. I didn't know how specific it was to Tennessee. I sort of thought it would be used more often, but it does look like it's sort of specific to Tennessee. It's interesting.
I had never heard of that before.
I've seen it mentioned in different articles that I read, like there was a blue alert issued, but it's one of those things I just never drilled down on it to see what they were looking for there. Like, I was thinking of this guy, Samuel Edwards, and I think I saw him back around the same time that Curtis Ray Watson was being caught. So Sam Edwards, I want to say exchanged gunfire or shot at a police officer over there. And I don't actually, now that we're sitting here talking about that, I keep wondering, did they ever catch him? This is another one, but he wasn't in custody. He was, Sam Edwards was one that...
he was going to be in custody.
Right. I think if I remember correctly, earlier this year, he was shot and killed, but it wasn't in Tennessee anymore. It was either Kentucky
another
or
one was he another one of the blue alerts in Tennessee?
Yeah, he was Sam Edwards. So Sam Edwards was another one who was also called on home security. I saw earlier in the year this picture that people put out with a guy running with 2 machine guns, from a backyard home security camera. And
that's not horrifying.
If you look up, he's got a middle initial, I think that's either a Q or a Z. So if it's Samuel Q, if you look up Samuel Q Edwards backyard gun, maybe you should find a really crazy picture of him. He almost the frame they froze it on. He almost looks like he's skipping. Do you know what I'm talking about? And this is horrible because this,
Tell me what his name is again.
Look up Samuel Q Edwards home security camera, maybe.
Okay.
I might be wrong. Maybe I'm misremembering it. It may not be as highly entertaining as I remember it to be, but I remember him getting caught up in. I think it was Kentucky, maybe. But he has had a couple of blue alerts along the way that I don't really remember.
He couldn't have had that many. There's only been 3 total.
Okay, he's had at least 1 blue alert in Tennessee. Wait, hold on. There we go. I found the picture.
Okay.
Did you find it?
No. I mean, I'm looking, but no.
Did you get a link from me just now?
Yeah.
Do you see the picture? I'm just copying and pasting for the sake of time. I'm just copying and pasting. That was what I was picturing when I was talking about it. So
You've seen that picture before, yeah.
Yeah, so that's Samuel Q. Edwards, according to
And
that Twitter.
when
There.
did his situation happen?
I don't remember. Like at one point, I thought it was in 2019, but now I don't know. Like I would have to go through and read about him again because he's not technically a.
Yeah, you're correct. On June 29th, 2022, the Blue Alert Samuel Q. Edwards was killed in exchange of gunfire with an officer.
Okay. I don't know when they issued that, but like, so he had shot or shot at I don't remember when a Tennessee officer. He popped up for a long time. Like there was constantly like I would get 10 press releases, and he was like one of every 10 press releases where they were looking for him. So I think that might be in relation to what you were talking about with the Blue Alert thing. They just keep sending out the press releases to keep people aware of him.
Right. So that was in Kentucky, apparently.
That he was shot and killed.
Right. Yeah. Like
That sounds
so.
right. Okay.
Yeah. So he's deceased after a exchange of gunfire with Kentucky State Police in Louisville. So
Yeah,
that
and
just
like
happened over the summer.
so that's sort of the opposite of escaping, I think. But so the case that I wanted to talk about today, it does have a tie to Tennessee. That's why I was talking about these different Tennessee things here, but not a recent tie. And like I don't get to do a lot of these like really old cases, but I wanted to do this one because there's a prison escape element to it. Now, they've all been found, but I still find the way that this all went down to be fascinating. Who we're talking about here is John Hunt Morgan. So, John Hunt Morgan, for those of you who have never heard that name before, he is not like a typical criminal. He is technically a war criminal. He was born in Huntsville, Alabama. He was the eldest of 10 children. The 10 children were all between Calvin and Henrietta Hunt Morgan. He was the uncle of a geneticist named Thomas Hunt Morgan, who was born in 1866, by the way. And he was the maternal grandson of John Wesley Hunt, who was a prominent businessman in Lexington, Kentucky. And he was one of the first millionaires that were west of the Allegheny Mountains. He's also the brother of A.P. Hill. And I know A.P. Hill because I went to Fort A.P. Hill when I was a Boy Scout many moons ago. A.P. Hill was a Confederate general who was killed in the American Civil War. And he was the brother-in-law of Basil Duke, who was another Confederate general. He was said to be a direct descendant of Revolutionary War general and hero Daniel Morgan. Morgan never used his middle name of Hunt during the war. It's something that people began to attach to him to distinguish him from other people named John Morgan as a post-war appellation. So the way that he ends up on our radar is as he's growing up on a farm outside of Lexington, Kentucky. He attends Transylvania College for 2 years. He gets kicked out in 1844. So 1844 is what we're talking about. He is dueling with a fraternity brother, which means two people have picked up weapons against each other. So that's what they used to do for hazing in 1844. And in 1846, Morgan became a Freemason. He wanted to have a military career, but the small size of the U.S. military at the time limited opportunities for officers' commissions. So he didn't want to just enlist. He wanted to also be commissioned as an officer of the U.S. Army or the U.S. military, but specifically the Army, in 1846. It's a really long time ago. In 1846, Morgan enlisted with his brother Calvin and his uncle Alexander as a cavalry private with the U.S. Army, and this is during the Mexican-American War. So Mexican-American War was just an armed conflict between the U.S. and Mexico from 1846 to 1848. He ends up being elected second lieutenant, and he gets promoted to first lieutenant before even arriving in Mexico. So then in Mexico, he sees combat at the Battle of Buena Vista. Battle of Buena Vista takes place February 22nd and February 23rd of 1847. So on his return to Kentucky, he became a hemp manufacturer. And in 1848, he married a woman named Rebecca Gratz Bruce. She was the 18-year-old sister of one of his business partners. So in 1848, he's only 23 years old. He marries an 18-year-old girl. And after the death of John Wesley Hunt, his grandfather, in 1849, his fortunes greatly improved. And his mother, Henrietta, she had begun to finance his business ventures. In 1853, his wife delivered a stillborn son, and she contacted what's known as milk leg. It's a phlebitis related to a thrombus or an infection of a blood clot in a vein. So she ends up eventually having an amputation. They grew apart, and he begins to be known as a generous gambler and womanizer. He had at least one slave son, which is a very controversial thing today. The slave son's name was Sidney Morgan, and he was the biological grandfather of the American inventor Garrett Morgan. So, Garrett Morgan, for those of you who may not know, he invented a 3-position traffic signal. So, he's not someone that we could live without. Yes.
Well, I just want to point out, just in case, like a slave son would be that he had a baby with a slave that
That
he
he
owned.
kept. Yeah.
Okay, and so and the American inventor, he was descended from that baby.
From that slave son. Yep.
Right.
Which is like, I don't know how to like talk about that. It's a fact of this case, and it's a terrible thing. And Morgan, he remained interested in the military, and he raised a militia artillery company in 1852. Now, the state legislature disbanded it in 1854, but in 1857, with the rise of sectional tensions, Morgan founded a company called Lexington Rifles. He spent much of his free time drilling his men as an independent infantry. So raising a company means he got together a group of people and he got together all the supplies, and he basically created his own little militia
Group.
Yeah, like it's almost like he created his own army, but it's a small one. Like most other Kentuckians, initially Morgan was not in support of seceding with the secession from the United States. Immediately after Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, he wrote to his brother Thomas Hunt Morgan, who was a student at Kenyon College in northern Ohio. And he said in those letters, "Our state will not, I hope, secede. I have no doubt, but Lincoln will make a good president. At least we ought to give him a fair trial. And then, if he commits some overt act, all the South will be a unit." By the following spring, Tom Morgan, who had also opposed Kentucky secession, had transferred home to the Kentucky Military Institute. He had begun to support the Confederacy. So he had left Ohio and he'd come down, and basically he said, "I'm going to be behind these guys." Just before the 4th of July, by way of a steamer from Louisville, Kentucky, he quietly left for Camp Boone, which was just across the Tennessee border. And he enlisted in the Kentucky State Guard. So John stayed at home in Lexington to tend to his troubled business and his ailing wife, Becky. But Becky died on July 21st of 1861. In September, Captain Morgan and his militia company went to Tennessee, and they joined the Confederate States Army. Morgan soon raised the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment and became its colonel on April 4th of 1862. So he's just moving up through all of these ranks over the years.
That's a really interesting thing that I guess I never realized that was part of how that happened.
Which part?
Like the way that he formed a group himself, and then it seems like there was a lot of stuff going on because of the conflict between the different sides of the war,
Civil
right?
War. Well, yeah,
And because essentially they were disbanded at first because it was outlawed. That's what it seemed like
correct.
it was being said. So he had made this group of people that they were training, so to speak, but like they're not in the actual military, right? It's just a
Correct.
private thing that he's done. And then as time goes forward and they're going more towards a battle, having the actual war, they just fall right into place.
Yeah, they do. It's actually pretty wild.
I never knew that that's how that happened that way. Did you?
Yeah, so his is like probably about 1/50th of what happened. Like the way that he did this, you got to think there's like 35 to 50 groups similar to that.
Sure.
It depends on where you pick them up in history because a lot of them had sort of to meld together. Just from a historical perspective, it's fascinating to look at. It's also a terrible time because
It
if
is.
we did that today and decided that like on either side doesn't like because technically it's hard to say it from the like perspective of the United States at that time. So you have the United States versus the Confederate States or the
It's
North,
the
which was
North
the United
versus
States
the South.
versus the South, right? So no matter how you say it, on both sides of that, there were terrible things happening, but some of the more terrible things, like if they were happening today on either side, we would look at them and be like, what the hell is going on?
Right, but I don't. I maybe it's because we're so far removed from it, but like there would be a problem with anybody that I personally know, like starting up a militia. I would have an issue with that.
Um, I it's weird that like so much of our history is steeped in this and people don't understand like how crazy it was because so honestly, Morgan, the guy that we're talking about here, John Morgan, he's not super interested in like anything to do with slavery or secession. Obviously, he's one of those guys that has some leadership skills and he has some business skills. But curiously, he just sort of goes along with everything else. He's like, "Oh, we're supposed to have slaves, and I've been given these slaves, so I'll just keep these slaves." And I don't know much about like his personal beliefs related to it, but he certainly didn't change it. And he even had slaves at this time. And as I previously mentioned, he had a slave son, which meant that he was also, no matter how you look at it, having some type of relationship or abusing a woman that he owned on paper. That like right there makes it all weird. But he's not necessarily on the side of like, yeah, we should definitely be fighting the North. What he is he's a guy who's just obsessed with the idea of the military. He's actually in the army at one point. When he was in the Mexican-American War, he was a U.S. Army officer. He starts out as a cavalry private, and when he leaves, I believe he left as a lieutenant. So if you're leaving out of the U.S. Army as a first lieutenant, that's that's a different way of life than what you suddenly have when you go back to Kentucky. But my point is, that's the U.S. Army. So now we have him in September of 1861 joining the Confederate States Army. He's not there because he believes in some kind of like big deal.
Well, we don't really know that. We just
He
know
says
that
it. He says it.
Okay. Well, I was just
So
going to say, we just know that the story lends to the fact that he sort of had this militia group together and they just went on over and joined.
that's what I was getting ready to say. Like, I honestly, like some of this and like, I'm not going to like go through the whole thing. I'm just going to say some of this reads like Morgan just didn't have anything better to do than dream of being an officer in the military. And he was like, you know what? Now I'm Captain Morgan and I'm going down here and I'm going to be the captain. And he did. So he goes and he raises what's known as the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment, which is a Kentucky-based part of the Confederate States Army. So he becomes the colonel of the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment on April 4th of 1862. Now, why that's a big deal is he ends up fighting in the Battle of Shiloh. It's one of the early battles in southern Tennessee, and that is from April 6th through the 7th of 1862. And inadvertently, because of his performance and his obsession with military and military leadership, he becomes a symbol to the secessionists in their hopes that Kentucky could be part of the Confederacy. So all he's really doing at that point is, and I'm going to be really polite about this, but I'm going to be blunt. He's playing war.
Well,
Because
I think a lot of people were. He was specifically tailored for this for some reason. I don't really know. It's a weird thing. It doesn't seem like. I mean, these people wouldn't have been alive during the Revolutionary War, right? So it must have been like the lore that continued on from that.
So this is almost 100 years after the Revolutionary War. This is
Right.
the 1860s. Although they do compare Morgan to Francis Marion, who was a military officer who served in the Revolutionary War, and was considered to be a really big deal in terms of how the British were handled by the U.S. forces at the time. And it's so weird for me to like attribute military terms to all of this because it would have looked very weird if you saw it. It would be like guys rolling down the street on horses with a cannon that they'd picked up. You know what I mean? It wouldn't look like the military marching in.
Well, specifically the Battle of Shiloh that you were talking about, that had to do with the states that hadn't fully chosen their position.
Yes.
The Confederate soldiers or the Confederate Army or whatever, they were trying to move as far north as they could, while I imagine the Union was pushing as far south as they could, right?
Yeah, this is just, in the early phases of war, it's not super heavy battles. It's just trying to sort of define the boundaries so that you know what you need to take.
Right. And so where Kentucky is and Tennessee, where they are, they were border states basically. So that's why his whole group, he's able to jump right in there because it's actually a point of contention as the war is starting.
Yeah, so all throughout 1862, what ends up happening is exactly what you're describing. There's push and pull back and forth across the Tennessee-Kentucky line. And in his first Kentucky raid, Morgan, on July 4th of 1862, he leaves Knoxville, Tennessee. He takes 900 men with him, and they end up sweeping through Kentucky. And they sweep through the army of a United States Army officer who had fought in the Seminole War and the Mexican American War and the American Civil War. He ends up in the American Civil War. So this guy is a major general. Now, supposedly Morgan reports back that they've captured 1,200 federal soldiers. He paroles them all, but he takes their horses. So they acquire hundreds of horses from these 1,200 soldiers, and they burn and destroy a massive quantity of their supplies. So at the time, technically, Kentucky was part of the Union military, if you want to call it that, the United States military. So President Lincoln starts getting notices that like they need help if they're going to hold Kentucky as a border rather than be taken, giving these Confederate States Army like a leg up. So in many ways, Morgan shocks them. So he ends up basically becoming a hero during this time, but also between July 4th of 1862, he goes from being Colonel Morgan to being Brigadier General Morgan on December 11th of 1862. Now, the promotion orders were not signed by President Davis until December 14th of 1862, but he had been operating that whole week as like the highest ranking official of the Confederate States Army. So on December 14th, 1862, which is a year and 6 months after his wife died, Becky, he gets married to Maddie Ready, who is the daughter of Tennessee United States Representative at the time, Charles Ready, and a cousin of William Haskell, who was also a congressman from Tennessee. Now, what they do in the next year, Morgan's men, becomes a really big deal. They start out 1863 by planning operations to move them sort of higher up. They're hoping to divert Union troops and Union resources in conjunction with two operations that they're trying to pull off at the same time. And that is an operation which is the Siege of Vicksburg, and then the Battle of Gettysburg, which is perhaps the most famous battle in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, of the Civil War from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. So this is summertime, and Morgan sets off to cross the Ohio River. He has his men raid southern Indiana and Ohio, and that is a huge deal because it puts them deep in Union territory. In Indiana, they met 450 local home guard in what was known as the Battle of Corydon on July 9th of 1863. 11 of the Confederates were killed and 5 of the home guard were killed. And then in July at Versailles, Indiana, while soldiers were raiding nearby militia and looting the county and city treasuries, and they were looting all the Masonic lodges, they were stealing everything they could get their hands on. One of the problems that came up was Morgan started to have some ethical issues. He was a Freemason, so when he knew that they were stealing the jewels from the local Masonic lodge, he actually recovered the jewels and returned them to the lodge the following day. And I think he had some trouble from there on out, like figuring out what to do, although he did have some more success. He had several more skirmishes, and he captured and paroled thousands of Union soldiers, which is a really weird practice where you basically take everything from them, shame them, and send them home. His raid almost ended on July 19th at Buffington Island, Ohio. 700 of his men were captured that day while trying to cross the Ohio River into West Virginia. They had been intercepted by Union gunboats, but 300 of his men made it across. Most of Morgan's men that were captured that day, they spent the rest of the war in what was known as Camp Douglas, which was a prisoner of war camp that was established in Chicago, Illinois. It also had an extremely high death rate. So most of the time, if you went to Camp Douglas, you did not leave. On July 26th, near Salineville, Ohio, Morgan and his exhausted, hungry, and saddle-sore soldiers were finally forced to surrender. The surrender site is marked with a massive rock and a plaque to this day. It was the farthest north that any uniformed Confederate troop penetrated during the war. So as much as it's a surrender, it's also a huge deal that Morgan got that deep into Union territory. It was never repeated in the entire time. He was chastised for surrendering by some of his men, but overall he was sort of heralded as a hero. Here is where he comes into our Christmas episodes. On November 27th, Morgan and 6 of his officers, which included the gentleman known as Thomas Henry Hines, who is a Confederate espionage expert. And honestly, Morgan and Hines, if they weren't Southerners, they would have the best action movie like framed around their lives for all of the weird things that Hines was able to pull off. He really was like sort of a model for what we think of now as James Bond, but he was doing it during the Civil War and technically doing it for the wrong side. They end up on November 27th of 1863, escaping from their cells in the Ohio Penitentiary. They dig a tunnel from Hines' cell into the inner yard. They ascend a wall with a rope that's made from the coverlets or the little quilts, little crappy thin quilts from their bunks, and a bent poker iron. So what they do is they take all these quilts and they tie them into like a cartoon-looking rope, and they take a poker iron that has been bent over the fire and they use it like a grappling hook. So this is like, in my mind, it's like the most comical thing. I don't know how accurate all of this is. If the story is accurate, considering how old it is hilarious. And then shortly after midnight, Morgan and 3 of his officers end up boarding a train from the nearby Columbus train station. They arrive in Cincinnati that morning, and then Morgan and Hines jump from the train before reaching the depot, and they escape into Kentucky, and they hire a boat to take them across the Ohio River. From there, they have like the reverse of the Underground Railroad, and they have the Southern sympathizers sort of chariot ride they're going on. They make it to safety. They get back to the South. Now, the same day that Morgan escaped, his wife gave birth to a daughter who died shortly before Morgan returned home. So the North and the South, the press is trying to cover all of this. And they caused, like, this whole Morgan's Raid time period in 1863 caused, like, a lot of doubts as to whether the Union would win the war. But at the end of it all, the press started to view it as something that had been, like I said, like more like the plot of a movie or a show. It was very showy, but ultimately it didn't help that much, even though they were able to get so deep into Union territory. I guess we have to wrap him up, like, so that people know what happened to him later in life. So obviously the South loses the war. After his return from Ohio, Morgan was returned to active duty, but the men that he was assigned were not the same as the men who had died and who had been imprisoned along the way. He once again began raiding into Kentucky, but he couldn't get these men to live up to like the discipline that he had with his first command. And he was unwilling or unable to control them. So every time they went in to do open pillaging, there were high casualty rates, and he kept having to refill men from home. The raids of this second season were pretty much in direct opposition to the strategic situation in the border states, which, because of how he had done the previous raid, the Union had adjusted their own strategies, and they were much better able to protect themselves from what he was doing. While he didn't have many new tricks, they knew all of his old tricks. And the Union military occupation in that region, they basically had progressed to the point that even like small groups of highly mobile raiders could no longer easily invade and steal and pillage from them. There was a lot of public outrage at Morgan's raid across the Ohio River, which may have contributed to how all of this was going. And his last Kentucky raid was carried out in June of 1864. This is part of what is known as the Second Battle of Cynthiana, which was fought in Harrison County, Kentucky on June 11th and June 12th in 1864. But after winning a minor victory on June 11th against an inferior infantry unit in the engagement known as the Battle of Keller's Bridge, this is outside of town, basically, Morgan decided to take a chance the following day on another battle against a superior Union mounted forces unit that he knew was approaching. So effectively, he was going to flank this massive, well-organized Union mounted unit that was coming in. And the result was a disaster for the Confederates. Basically, it destroyed Morgan's unit as a cohesive force, and only a couple of them escaped with their lives. Most of them ended up being captured. A couple of them escaped, but that made them fugitives from justice, and that included John Morgan. And after this raid, it was revealed that it was unauthorized. So General Bragg, who had taken over while Morgan had been incarcerated, he never trusted Morgan again because of some of the stuff that he had done in Ohio. And on August 22nd, 1864, nevertheless, Morgan was again placed in command of the Trans-Allegheny Department. So at the time, the Confederate forces in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia were coming together to form like a pretty cohesive unit. So some Confederate authorities were quietly looking at Morgan to possibly charge him with what's known as banditry. which would have led to his removal from command. Ultimately, they were trying to stop him from continuing these raids that cost them a lot of resources and a lot of people. Nevertheless, he kept doing these raids. He aimed at a raid in Knoxville, Tennessee. It did not seem like that raid was going to work out. So instead, on September 4th of 1864, he ends up getting a little karma. And that is when Union soldiers surprise him in a raid on Greenville, Tennessee, which ironically, Greenville had been named for Nathaniel Greene, who was a Revolutionary War hero. And Greenville, Tennessee is the second oldest town in Tennessee. So Morgan, at this point, he was, I guess, getting up there in age for a soldier. Although he was born in 1825, he would have been 39. He was attempting to get away when he was shot in the back and killed by Union cavalrymen. His burial was shortly before the birth of his second child, another daughter. He is buried in Lexington, Kentucky, and Lexington Cemetery. So that's our first prison escapee story, and it's sort of wrapped around a bunch of history stuff. And I know we don't get into like a lot of history stuff, but there's always like some fascinating stuff, and there's definitely a lot of crime in there, don't you think?
Well, yeah, there is. And actually, I was thinking about it because, we get all obsessed by like one murder or two murders, right? And like, you have to admit, from our perspective, looking back, this entire situation was futile. Like,
It was like the Old West.
and a lot of lives were unnecessarily lost, and this kind of sheds new light on it though, because I didn't realize how much, like, this guy was playing war, like you said, and he was doing things that were risky, and he was sacrificing his group because he was in control, right? But the things that he was doing, while he did get, pretty far north, it didn't matter. Like, the only thing that happened was it can be said that he got to that point, right? That's it.
Yeah.
But I feel like this looks really interesting because he would be, he's responsible for a lot of deaths, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And while this is kind of, war is held in a different light than crime, right? Some of the stuff that was happening, there really isn't a whole lot of difference, right? If there was some sort of point to it, which, obviously the Civil War had a point, it's just the extent and the way that this was being carried out, it was futile. He proved it. But there's so much crime involved in that.
Yeah, he was operating under a guy that's like known to be basically the worst general in the war. And it's even weird to like look at how did he become that general. But the guy he's operating under is a guy named Braxton Bragg, who is like, everything Braxton Bragg is doing is a war crime, like from the jump.
Well, the raid, Morgan's raid, which is
Right.
what we talked about,
Yeah.
he had been specifically ordered by General Braxton Bragg not to cross that river
Yeah.
because there was information that the Union forces had over 110,000 militia in those states. And so, like, that wasn't for nothing, right? They didn't order him not to cross the river for no reason. Like, he was sending everybody into a death trap.
Yeah, he was, but so he was smart about it. What he did in Indiana sort of showed how smart that he was. He sent Thomas Hines in with a group of 20 guys, and they were posing as a Union patrol that was on a secret mission. So what they were trying to do there is they were trying to figure out if they could recruit another local group of guys playing army. Like they literally went in to try and get this group, the Copperheads, which sounds crazy, but I'm telling you, this would like make the most amazing limited series. So these groups had no real allegiances, but like Hines would go in there, and like I said, he's like, talented Mr. Ripley, James Bond, all roll it into one. He goes in, but like he finds out that like there's no support for them in Indiana. So while Morgan is dealing with the information from Bragg from above, he's also dealing with like what he's creating on the ground with the guys like Hines. And Hines is made out to be a little bit of a superhero in all of this, but like realistically, he just was too dumb to know to stop. Like he just liked the idea of everything. And
That's all that he was doing, I think. Like this is going to be fun,
yeah, he was just absolutely like
I'm going to accomplish this, right?
he was looking for a way to have status. And honestly, he didn't even know what he was doing. But if you follow along with Hines over the years, he spent a lot of time actually trying to get those guys back that were part of like Morgan's units. He tried to like help them escape. And then at one point in time, he was the subject of a massive manhunt because the legend says that Hines was thought to have been John Wilkes Booth. And there's a period of time where he was mistaken for him. And in later years, there are a couple of images that I don't know if they're sketches or photographs, but he sort of looks a little bit like John Wilkes Booth, who obviously is, one of the most famous assassins in history. And he didn't die till 1898. That fascinates me, by the way, that he lived that long. Because that means, so 1898, he would have been 60 years old. So if you go back so he was in his 20s and 30s doing all of this work to basically be part of Morgan's raid, but he was so much more than just a part of that. Like this guy was like a really interesting spy. And honestly, I think if someone from the Union had caught Hines like well and good and offered him enough money, I totally think he would have done the exact same job going back the other way.
I think that the majority of this, now he's different, but the majority of the soldiers, they literally followed the flow of what was happening around them.
Yep.
And because the biggest differentiation between the Union and the Confederacy was location, right?
Yep.
Just by sort of default. Now, obviously the battle lies in those middle areas, like we were talking about, with Kentucky and Tennessee. But, people who lived above the Mason-Dixon line, is that
technically technically the Mason-Dixon line is relevant.
Because if you were above the Mason-Dixon line, you would, by default, unless you, specifically decided not to be, you would be part of the Union, right?
Right.
And then if you're below it, by default, you would be part of the Confederacy, unless you specifically weren't, right?
Well, the line, the original Mason-Dixon line was much further north, but yeah, I mean, it's still, that idea comes into play here, depending on who you talk to.
You were just saying that you felt like Hines would probably have done the exact same job on the other side if somebody had recruited him. Absolutely. I feel like the soldiers involved in these situations, they would have done what they did with, regardless of which side they were on. I don't know how many of these militia groups were really fighting for the underlying principles, as opposed to just strategically playing war.
Yeah, I mean, so you do have a real army on the Union side. It's that's the United States military operating. But you're right. As the war goes on and as things get bigger and bigger outside of the Great Raid of 1863, you have a lot of soldiers who are not this war drags on for 5 years, and it's not like a war today. So you have a lot of soldiers replacing. You have a lot of people playing army replacing actual soldiers.
Or it seems like you have people playing soldiers to begin with, and they just keep dying and being replaced with more people playing soldiers.
Yeah, the Southerners in this sense, they were really at a loss for people. like, because if you look at the peaks of both of the armies during the war, the U.S. Army itself, the Union Army, had a total of about 2.5 million people come through. But the peak, the biggest size of its army, was about 500 to 600,000 people. The Southern Confederate Army, whatever, Southern States Army, it never got bigger than 1 million people total. But its peak of how many active people they had at one time was around 350,000. The difference is, for the Union Army, that didn't include the guys playing soldier. For the Confederate Army, it was all the guys playing soldier. Now, some of those guys, yeah, some of those guys were former military, and some of those guys would have been part of the Union Army or the U.S. Army. But when things split and battles became real and people like John Morgan got into the fray, I think the weirdest part is, depending on where you were standing the day things happened, that really determined which side of the war you were on.
Exactly. It was like almost 100% pure geography. Now, what's interesting is at some point when you were telling his story, you talk about him writing his brother in Ohio.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not exactly sure what he said, but it sounded like he could have been persuaded either way at that point.
He said he would give Lincoln a fair trial. There are, like, I've read different allusions to the idea that the Emancipation Proclamation pissed him off. It sort of depends on, like, where you look at things in time. But the truth is, guys like him, if you had offered them a paycheck and told them they can keep doing the same thing they do, like, it doesn't matter what Lincoln said, really. I don't think he was heavily politically active, but back then, like, people did not have as much to do to entertain themselves or keep them busy. I don't know how you want to say that, but, like, you know, today we have lots of hobbies. This guy's hobby was making army units. That's what he did for fun.
Yeah. It you know, from a crime perspective, he could be considered a little bit of a criminal.
Oh, he was a good criminal too. I mean, he's interesting to me, and, like, I am shocked that, like, that these stories don't get more attention, and I wonder if, like, you know, they ever will, because
I think it's still such a sore spot.
Yeah.
Because while it was a long time ago, it wasn't all that long ago. And
No, it really wasn't.
there's sort of a fundamental misunderstanding or non-understanding, I think, of the Civil War in general, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that I'm from the South. Well, I consider it the South, and there's a lot of people who are clueless about what all that stuff really means.
In the South, you mean?
In the South, yes.
Yeah. So I find it hard to get into those conversations with people, and I'll say it this way. To a point, I fully empathize with certain things that were, like, done, particularly by the people that were sort of standing in a place and told to do a thing. But I don't really have enough of an understanding of how terrible it would have been to have, like, on the bad side of things, where people were owning people. Like, right there, I sort of check out, because I'm like, how? Like, and I know that slavery still happens today, but when I look at that type of, like, sort of institutionally and governmentally condoned ownership of human beings, like,
well, that's the main point of the Civil War.
I fall apart trying to explain to people who just want to tell me about heritage and, like, how industry flag. And and I'm just like, I can't.
That's the biggest thing for me is all the Confederate flags I see. Like,
well, I hear people yell both ways, like, why is everything so woke and why aren't we doing more? And I just look at stuff and I'm like, guys, people were owning people, like, with titles. like cars. So these are going to be our Christmas episodes. What are we doing? Like, what all do you want me to do here for Christmas? Like, how many do you want to do?
Whatever you want to do is cool with me, yo.
So we're doing a bunch of Christmas episodes, and this is the first one that we're recording. It's a little weird that we threw in some history. I think it's crime related. We've gone sort of back and forth on how this part will work. But at the end of the day, what we really wanted to do is put together a series of episodes that would occur like over the holidays that people could listen to where, if you're not out doing a lot of family stuff, because like we do our family stuff and then sort of like we have downtime. Like
I think that our 12 Days of Christmas last year was received very well. People really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it seemed to be. It seems to be some people's favorite thing. So that's why we're doing it again. And we're recording this as we go because we just wanted to be sort of ahead of the game. But
yeah, because of how we ended up having to do it last year, it was crazy. But maybe this year will be slightly less crazy. But it's nice to have like a sequence of a series of things to listen to when you have some time.
So I hope people are having good holidays. Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabbratiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabbratiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
21 days I spent the better half of the year just holding your space. I've got all the lights hanging up you can see from the street, but if you're not coming over you can light up my dreams. Every snowfall reminds me to call, 'cause I know if you're not here then it's not Christmas at all. But this year, oh, I believe you're coming back to me. I'll be your angel when the snow's coming down. The song is singing and you're here all around. Small piece of heaven on earth in this town. It's only Christmas if you're coming around. If you're coming around, oh, oh. If you're coming around. If you're coming around. You feel like Christmas every day of the year, but I can't feel it by myself. Only works if you're here. And a little bit of magic and a